The diplomatic vessel Gentle Horizon was dying in the cold darkness of space warning lights. Flashed red across every console, and the ship screamed as metal twisted in engines. Failed one after another in a terrible chain reaction that no engineer could stop. Ambassador Kethvari gripped his seat with all four of his delicate hands and watched the viewport with wide silver eyes that had never known true fear until this moment. The planet below them was growing larger with every passing second, and it was the worst possible planet in this entire sector of the Galaxy Vaxxer 9. Even the name sent shivers through the spines of every species that knew anything about survival ratings and planetary classifications. It was a Class 7 death world where the gravity crushed bones and the rain burned flesh, and the creatures that lived in its red jungles hunted anything that moved with a hunger that never stopped. The Vellani crew numbered 12 in total, and every single one of them was screaming, or crying, or praying to gods that seemed very far away at this terrible moment. Every single one except for the human Lieutenant Commander Maya. Chun sat at her security station, with her hands moving across the controls in quick and steady patterns. Face showed no panic, and her breathing remained slow, and even as she worked through calculations that her crewmates could not understand, she was the only human on the ship, and the Vellani had never quite known what to make of her during the 6 months of their diplomatic mission together. Maya was short by human standards, but she moved with a quiet confidence that made her seem larger than her small frame suggested. Her dark hair was pulled back tight against her head, and her brown eyes held a focus that never seemed to waver no matter what happened around her. Hull breach in sections 4 through 7, she announced in a calm voice that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. We have approximately 3 minutes until atmospheric entry. Ambassador Kethvari turned his translucent face toward her, and his voice came out as a trembling whisper. We are going to die. Maya did not look at him, but her answer was immediate and certain. Not today, Ambassador. She pulled up the planetary scans on her screen and studied them with the intensity of a predator watching prey. The red jungles of Vaxxer to 9 spread across the surface like infected wounds, and twin suns blazed down upon a world that seemed designed by some cruel god to kill anything foolish enough to land there. There, Maya said, and pointed to a spot on the map. That plateau has defensible terrain, and I am reading a fresh water source nearby. First Officer Yamori stared at her with something between confusion and horror painted across his narrow features. You cannot be serious, he said. That world will kill us in hours. Maya finally turned to look at him, and something ancient and hard flickered in her eyes for just a moment before disappearing behind her professional mask. Then I will have to work fast. The ship hit the atmosphere, and everything became fire and noise and terror. Maya grabbed the manual controls and fought the dying vessel with every ounce of skill she possessed, while the Vellani screamed around her. She did not scream, she did not pray, she simply worked with a focus that seemed almost inhuman to the creatures watching her. Ground came up fast, and Maya angled the ship toward the plateau she had identified and pulled back on the controls. With muscles that burned from the strain, they hit hard. The impact threw everyone forward, and metal screamed and glass shattered, and then there was silence except for the groaning of the broken ship settling into its final resting place. Maya was the first one moving. She unstrapped herself and checked her body for injuries with quick, efficient movements of her hands. A cut on her forehead was bleeding, but she ignored it as she moved through the cabin, checking on each crew member. One by one. Ambassador Kethvari's status report. The old diplomat opened his silver eyes and looked up at her with an expression of pure disbelief. I am alive, he whispered. How am I alive? Because I landed us. Maya said simply, can you move? He could. And so could the others, though. Several had broken bones, and all of them were shaking with shock and fear. Maya gathered them in the central cabin and took stock of their situation with the cold logic of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of disaster. The distress beacon is damaged, but I can repair it, she said. However, even with the beacon working, rescue will take approximately 18 standard days to reach us. 18 days. The words fell like stones into a pool of despair, navigator. Pelani let out a sound that was half sob and half moan. We cannot survive 18 days on a death world, she said. The Vellani are not built for such places. Maya nodded slowly, and her eyes moved to the viewport where the red jungle waited beyond. The broken glass, the twin suns were setting, and strange sounds were already rising from the darkness between the alien trees' howls. And clicks and something that sounded almost like laughter, but wrong and hungry and patient. You are correct, Maya said. The Vellani are not built for death worlds. She paused and reached for her survival pack that she always kept ready, because humans learned long ago that the universe did not care about comfort or safety. But humans are. She pulled out her equipment and began sorting through it with hands that never trembled, despite the impossible situation. They faced Ambassador Kethvari, watched her with growing wonder, and asked the question that burned in all their minds. What are you going to do? Maya looked up at him and smiled for the first time since the crash. It was not a happy smile or a comforting smile. It was the smile of something that had evolved on a world almost as savage as this one, and had learned to not just survive, but to conquer. I am going to build you a shelter, she said, and I am going to keep you alive until rescue comes. The Vellani looked at each other with expressions that mixed hope and doubt in equal measure. They had read about humans in their databases, and they knew the stories about Deathworlders, but reading about something and seeing it with your own eyes were two very different experiences. Outside the ship, the creatures of Vaxxer 9 were gathering in the darkness. They could smell the crash and the blood and the fear. They were hungry and they were patient, and they had never encountered prey quite like what waited inside that broken vessel. They did not know it yet, but they were about to learn a very important lesson about the difference between predator and prey, and about the terrible mistake of underestimating a human. The first Vellani to step outside the crashed ship was a young engineer named Torix, who believed himself braver than the others. Made it exactly 47 steps before his hollow bones began to crack under the crushing weight of gravity. That was nearly 1.5 times what his body was designed to handle. Maya caught him before he hit the ground and carried him back inside like he weighed nothing at all. The Vellani medic Sinara rushed forward with her medical scanner, and her thin fingers trembling as she assessed the damage. 3 fractures in his leg bones, she announced with horror in her voice, and his respiratory system is already showing signs of stress from the atmospheric pressure. Maya laid the young engineer down gently and looked at the rest of the crew with an expression that mixed sympathy with hard truth. None of you can go outside, she said. The gravity alone will kill you within hours, and that is before we consider the air quality. She pulled up her scanner and showed them the readings that painted a picture of a world designed for death. The atmosphere contains spores that will trigger severe allergic reactions in Vellani biology, she explained. The local water sources are acidic, enough to burn your internal organs if consumed without filtration, and the temperature during daylight hours will exceed your thermal tolerance by a significant margin. First Officer Yelmori stepped forward with his silver skin pale from fear, but his voice steady with the authority of his position. Then we stay in the ship, he declared. We seal the breaches and wait for rescue. Maya shook her head slowly. The hull is compromised in too many places, she said. I have analyzed the local weather patterns, and the acid rain that falls every 3 days will eat through our weakened structure within 6 days. She let that sink in and watched as hope drained from their faces like water from a broken vessel. We need proper shelter, she continued, something built to withstand this environment. Ambassador Kethvari spread his 4 hands in a gesture of helpless confusion. But we cannot go outside to build anything, he said. You just told us the planet will kill us. Maya picked up her survival pack and slung it over her shoulders with the ease of long practice. "The planet will kill you," she agreed. "It will not kill me." She moved toward the damaged airlock and began checking her equipment one final time. Water purification tablets and a knife made from hardened steel and rope woven from synthetic fibers and a small plasma cutter salvaged from the engineering section, and a dozen other items that seemed pitifully inadequate against the horrors waiting outside. "I am going to conduct a perimeter assessment," she announced. "I need to identify resources for construction and locate defensible positions and map the local predator territories." The Villani stared at her in silence. Finally, young Terex spoke from where he lay on his medical cot with his voice weak but filled with genuine curiosity. "How long will this assessment take?" Maya checked the position of the twin suns through the cracked viewport. "I will return before the second sunset," she said. "Approximately 3 hours. Alone," Navigator Pelani whispered. "You are going out there alone." Maya turned to look at her, and something in her expression made the navigator take an involuntary step backward. "I've always been alone," Maya said. Quietly, "Humans learned long ago that we cannot depend on the universe to be kind." She cycled the airlock and stepped out into the red hell of Vaxer 9. The heat hit her like a physical blow, and the gravity pulled at her bones with greedy fingers. But she had trained on heavy gravity worlds, and her muscles were dense with the strength of a species that had evolved to chase prey across endless savannas. The jungle spread before her in shades of crimson and orange, and deep arterial purple trees rose toward the sky like twisted fingers, and their bark glittered with silica deposits that caught the light of the twin suns. Creatures moved in the shadows between those trees, and Maya could feel their eyes upon her as she began her survey. She moved with purpose and confidence, and the predators watched her with growing uncertainty. This prey did not run, and it did not hide, and it did not smell of fear. It smelled of something else entirely, something dangerous. Maya mapped the terrain in her mind as she walked, and she noted every resource that might serve her purpose. The silica trees would provide excellent structural material once she found a way to cut them down. A freshwater spring bubbled up from rocks about 400 meters to the north, and her scanner confirmed it was acidic but filterable with the right materials. Cave systems dotted the cliffs to the east, but her thermal scanner showed large heat signatures inside them. Something lived in those caves, something big. She would deal with that later if necessary. For now, she focused on the immediate needs of shelter and water and defense. 3 hours later, she returned to the ship, covered in mud, the color of dried blood, with a gash across her forearm where something with too many teeth had tried to taste her. The Villani medic nearly fainted when she saw the wound, not because of its severity, but because of what was happening to it. The blood was clotting before their eyes, and the edges of the wound were already beginning to close with a speed that seemed almost magical to species whose injuries took weeks to heal. "How?" Sonara breathed as she scanned the wound with trembling hands. "Your body is repairing itself." Maya glanced down at her arm with mild interest. "Human healing factor," she said. "We evolved on a world where injuries were common, and those who could not recover quickly did not survive to reproduce." She turned to address the full crew and laid out her findings with the precision of a military briefing. "I have identified a construction site approximately 200 meters from the ship," she began. "The terrain provides natural drainage for acid rain, and the tree coverage offers protection from aerial predators." She pulled up a rough map on her datapad and showed them the location. "The freshwater source is close enough to access, but far enough to avoid drawing predators directly to our shelter." She continued, "I have also mapped the territories of the 3 largest predator species in the immediate area." First Officer Yelmori studied the map with growing amazement. "You learned all of this in 3 hours?" Maya nodded. "Humans are pattern recognition specialists," she explained. Our brains evolved to spot threats and opportunities in complex environments very quickly. She set down her pack and began organizing her salvaged equipment into neat piles. "Tomorrow I begin construction," she announced. "The shelter will take approximately 7 days to complete. If I work efficiently." Ambassador Kethvari approached her slowly with his silver eyes searching her face for something he could not quite name. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You could conserve your energy and resources for your own survival." Maya looked at him, and for a moment, her professional mask slipped to reveal something warmer. "Beneath, because you are my crew," she said simply. "And humans do not abandon their people." She turned back to her equipment and began preparing for the work. Ahead outside the ship, the predators of Vaxxer 9 circled in the darkness and tested the air with senses designed to find weakness and fear. They found neither. Instead, they found something that made them pause and reconsider their usual hunting strategies. They found the scent of a Deathworlder for the first time in their evolutionary history. They were not sure if they were the hunters or the hunted. The Vellani gathered at the cracked viewport each morning and watched the human work. They could not look away, even though what they witnessed challenged everything they understood about the universe and the creatures that lived in it. Maya began. At first light, when the twin suns rose over the crimson jungle and painted the sky in shades of orange and violent red, she did not wait for perfect conditions or optimal circumstances, because humans had learned across millions of years that perfect conditions never came on the first day. She felled trees. The plasma cutter from engineering worked for approximately 2 hours before its power cell died and left her standing in a half-cleared space with nothing but determination and primitive tools. Any Vellani would have stopped at that point and tried to find another technological solution. Maya simply bent down and picked up a stone navigator. Talani watched through magnifying sensors as the human spent the next hour shaping that stone against other stones until she had created something their database identified as an axe, a tool that predated interstellar travel by hundreds of thousands of years on the human homeworld, a tool that humans still remembered how to make even after conquering the stars. Maya swung that stone axe for 6 hours straight and felled 12 trees that each stood taller than the crashed ship. The Vellani engineer Torix calculated the force required for each swing and the cumulative energy expenditure. And he could not make the numbers work. No species should have been able to sustain that level of physical output for that length of time. But humans were not like other species. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters on a world where the climate tried to kill them, and the predators tried to eat them, and even the plants tried to poison them. Humans had learned to simply refuse to stop on the second day. Maya dug the foundation. She used a shovel improvised from shipwreckage and her own 2 hands, and she moved earth that was dense with minerals and heavy with a moisture. First Officer Yalmori ran the calculations 3 times because he could not believe the results. She has moved approximately 2.3 metric tons of soil, he announced to the crew gathered at the viewport, in a single day. Ambassador Kethvari shook his head slowly, and his silver eyes reflected the impossible scene before them. "I have read about Deathworlders in our cultural archives," he said quietly. "I thought the accounts were exaggerated." He paused and watched Maya pack earth into walls with her bare hands. "I was wrong." On the 3rd day, the predator came. It burst from the jungle with 6 limbs churning and armor plates gleaming and a mouth full of teeth designed to tear through the toughest hide on Vaxxer 9. It weighed approximately 200 kilograms, and it had killed every creature it had ever hunted. It had never hunted a human before. The Vellani screamed warnings through the communication system, but Maya did not run. She picked up a branch she had sharpened the night before and waited with her feet planted and her eyes locked on the charging beast. Predator was fast. Maya was faster. She sidestepped at the last moment and drove the sharpened branch through the gap in the creature's armor where its forward limbs met its torso. The beast screamed and thrashed, and Maya held on with a grip that would not break. Then she did something that made the watching Villani physically ill. She finished the creature with her bare hands. Medic Sinara had to look away, but she could not block out the sounds of the struggle or the terrible silence that followed. When she finally forced herself to look again, Maya was standing over the dead predator with blood that was not her own dripping from her hands. The human was breathing hard, but her eyes held no fear and no trauma, only calculation. Good, Maya said to herself, protein source secured. She spent the rest of that day skinning the creature and harvesting its meat and treating its hide for use as roofing material. That night she ate part of the predator raw because her rations were running low and cooking would have attracted more hunters. The Villani historian accessed their database and searched for context that might help them understand what they were witnessing. He found entries on Deathworlder species and their classifications. Humans were listed as Class 12, the highest rating in the Galactic database. The footnotes described them as persistence predators with toxic biochemistry and anomalous tissue, regeneration, and psychological resilience beyond model parameters. The historian read one line 3 times before he fully absorbed its meaning. Human endurance exceeds that of any known species when sufficiently motivated. He looked out at Maya, who was now hanging strips of predator meat to dry in the last light of the setting suns. Sufficiently motivated, he whispered. Days 4 through 7 blurred together into a marathon of construction that the Villani would remember for the rest of their lives. Maya built walls from silica wood, sealed with rendered animal fat that she had collected from her kill. She constructed a filtration system from charcoal. She burned herself and sand she gathered from a riverbed and salvaged components from the ship. She dug a fire pit with ventilation channels that would draw smoke away from the sleeping areas, and she lined it with stones that would hold heat through the cold nights. She built defensive spikes around the perimeter and coated them with toxins she had extracted from local plants, the same plants that had evolved to kill anything that touched them. Maya touched them anyway. Her hands blistered and bled, and healed and blistered again. She did not stop on the 7th day. The shelter stood completed. It was not beautiful by any standard of galactic architecture. It was squat and rough and primitive in ways that made the Villani uncomfortable to look upon, but it was solid, and it was safe, and it would keep 12 fragile aliens alive on a world that wanted nothing more than to kill them. Maya returned to the ship that evening and stood before the crew with exhaustion etched into every line of her face, but she was smiling. The shelter is ready, she announced. I will begin transferring supplies tomorrow, and then I will move you one at a time using a carrying harness I have constructed. Ambassador Kethvari approached her with tears streaming down his translucent face. Why? He asked again, because he still could not understand. Why would you do all of this for us? Maya looked at him, and her smile softened into something almost gentle. On my world we have a saying, she replied. No one gets left behind. She paused and looked out at the jungle, where predators still circled and waited for their chance. I do not care if this planet thinks it can kill you, she said. I did not ask for its permission to keep you alive. The Villani had no response to that. They simply stood in silence and tried to comprehend the creature before them. This human who had built a fortress from nothing. This Deathworlder who refused to let the universe decide who lived and who died. Outside the shelter, the predators of Vaxonine watched and waited. They had seen what the human condoned for the first time in their existence. They were afraid. Day 12 began like any other day on Vaxonine, with twin suns rising over a jungle that wanted everything dead. Maya had moved all 12 Villani into the shelter over the previous 4 days, and they had begun to settle into something almost resembling routine. The ambassador spent his mornings meditating in the corner while Navigator Pelani helped track weather patterns using salvaged equipment. Medic Sinara had established a small medical station where she treated the minor ailments that came from living in such harsh conditions. First Officer Yelmori coordinated supply distribution and made sure everyone ate and drank at regular intervals. They had begun to hope. That was when the Reavers came. Maya heard them before anyone else because human ears had evolved to detect predators in the dark forests of a world just as savage as this one. A low rumbling sound that vibrated through the ground and rose into the air like distant thunder. But this thunder had purpose and hunger and intelligence behind it. Everyone into the inner chamber now, Maya commanded in a voice that allowed no argument. The Villani scrambled to obey because they had learned in the past 12 days that when Maya gave an order in that tone, it was not a suggestion. Ambassador Kethvari paused at the entrance to the inner chamber and looked back at her with fear bright in his silver eyes. "What is coming?" he asked. Maya was already gathering her weapons, which consisted of sharpened stakes and the blade she had forged from shipwreckage and several pouches of toxic powder. "The locals call them Reavers in the translation database," she said. "Pack hunters with rudimentary intelligence and no fear." She pushed him gently toward the chamber. "Seal the door and do not open. And until I tell you," she instructed, "no matter what you hear, but you cannot fight them alone." Pelani protested from inside the chamber. Maya looked at her and smiled the terrible smile that the Villani had come to recognize, the smile of a predator. "About to do what predators do, I am never alone," Maya said. "I carry 60,000 years of human survival with me." She sealed the door from the outside and turned to face the jungle. The Reavers emerged from the tree line like nightmares given flesh. There were 9 of them, and each one was the size of a small ground transport with 6 legs and armored plates and mouths that could bite through steel. They moved in formation because they were smart enough to coordinate and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. They had learned these tactics over millions of years of evolution on a world that punished mistakes with extinction. Maya studied them with calm eyes and counted their number and noted their positioning. 9 was a lot. 9 was possibly too many, but humans had faced worse odds throughout their history and survived. Sometimes survival was not about winning. Sometimes it was simply about refusing to lose. The lead Reaver charged, and Maya moved inside the sealed chamber. The Villani huddled together and listened through the communication unit that Maya wore. What they heard would haunt their dreams for years to come. Sounds of combat began with roars and impacts and the crack of breaking wood. They heard Maya breathing in sharp controlled bursts. They heard her voice once when she shouted something in a human language that their translators could not parse. They heard wet sounds that might have been blood, or might have been worse. They heard screaming, but they could not tell if it came from predator or prey. Then silence, long, terrible silence that stretched on until Ambassador Kethvari was certain his heart would stop from the tension. More silence. Then Maya's voice came through the communicator, rough with exhaustion, but steady with that unbreakable human determination. "Clear." A pause. "Perimeter secure." Another pause. "Going to need a few hours to reset the traps." First Officer Yelmori was the first to unseal the door despite Maya's instructions. Because he could not wait any longer, he stepped outside and immediately fell to his knees. Not from the gravity this time. From what he saw, the ground around the shelter was torn and bloody and covered with evidence of a battle that should have been impossible for one person to survive. 7 Reaver corpses lay scattered across the perimeter. 7 of the most dangerous predators on Vaxxer 9, killed by a single human in a single night. Maya sat by the fire pit with her back against the shelter wall and her hands working to stitch a wound on her thigh. She was covered in blood, both her own and theirs. Her left arm hung at an angle that suggested damage, and her face was swollen on one side, and she was missing a chunk of flesh from her shoulder. But she was alive, and she was already planning her next move. 2 escaped, she reported, as the other Villani emerged to witness the aftermath. They will tell others, and we may face another attack before rescue arrives. Ambassador Kethvari walked toward her on unsteady legs and knelt beside her despite the pain the gravity caused in his hollow bones. "Why do you do this?" he asked for the third time since the crashes. Voice cracked with emotion that he could no longer contain. "Risk your life and suffer and fight when you could have hidden with us behind that door." Maya looked up at him, and her brown eyes held something ancient and fierce and unutterably human, and watched you die. She replied. She shook her head slowly. "That is not how humans work, Ambassador." She gestured at the carnage around them with a hand that trembled slightly from blood loss. "When things go wrong, we do not conserve our strength and wait for the end." She continued. "We build and we fight and we adapt." She paused, and something flickered behind her eyes, something that connected her to every human who had ever stood against impossible odds and refused to surrender. "We survived ice ages," she said. "We survived extinction events and plagues and wars that killed millions." She looked at the dead reavers and then back at the ambassador. "We crawled out of caves and learned to throw rocks at things that wanted to eat us, and we kept throwing rocks until we reached the stars." She smiled through cracked and bloody lips. "This," she gestured at the savage world around them. "This is Tuesday." The ambassador did not understand the reference, but he understood the meaning. Humans had faced worse, humans had always faced worse, and humans had always survived. He reached out and took her uninjured hand in his and squeezed gently. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for being what you are." Maya squeezed back, and for a moment her mask dropped completely. "Thank you for being worth protecting," she replied. Then the moment passed and she was all business again. "Help me get these bodies processed," she said. "Reaver hide makes excellent armor, and we have 6 more days until rescue." The Villani worked through the night beside their human guardian. They could not do much because of the gravity in their fragile bodies, but they did what they could, and somehow that felt like enough. By morning, the perimeter was restored and the traps were reset, and Maya had slept for exactly 2 hours before waking to begin her patrol somewhere in the jungle. The 2 surviving reavers watched from a distance they had never needed to maintain before. They did not attack again. Some lessons only needed to be taught once. Day 18 arrived with twin suns breaking through clouds, the color of bruised flesh, and Maya standing at her usual post on the perimeter. She had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the reaver attack and the dark circles under her eyes told a story of vigilance that bordered on obsession. But her eyes remained sharp and her stance remained ready, because 18 days was not 17 days. Anything could still happen. The Villani had grown stronger in their own way during the ordeal. Ambassador Kethvari had taken to leading morning discussions about what they had witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of humans. Navigator Pelani had learned to track weather patterns using nothing but observation and memory because Maya had taught her medic. Senara had developed new treatment protocols for human injuries after watching Maya heal from wounds that would have killed any Villani 3 times over. They had all changed, but none had changed more than their perception of the species they had once dismissed as young and primitive and lucky. The sound came from the sky at mid-morning, a high, deep thrumming vibration that made the jungle fall silent in a way it never had before. Maya tilted her head back and watched as a Galactic Union rescue cruiser descended through the atmosphere with its hull gleaming silver against the red sky. "Rescue has arrived," she announced to the Villani gathered in the shelter doorway. "Prepare for evacuation." The cruiser landed in the clearing Maya had created on day 1, and its boarding ramp lowered to reveal a rescue team composed of a dozen different species. The team leader was a Korath named Commander Vesal, who had participated in over 200 rescue operations across the galaxy. He had seen crash ships and dead crews in the aftermath of Deathworld encounters more times than he could count. I had never seen anything like this. The compound spread before him in defiance of everything he understood about survival odds on Class 7 planets. Fortified, walls rose from the alien soil and defensive structures circled the perimeter in patterns that spoke of military training. Water filtration systems hummed quietly, and preserved food hung from racks. And a garden of sorts had been started using seeds from the crashed ship's emergency supplies, while Valani stood in the doorway of the main shelter, 12 living, breathing. Valani on a world that should have killed them in hours and standing at the perimeter with her back straight and her eyes alert was a single human woman. Commander Vexal approached her slowly because something in her posture suggested that sudden movements would be unwise. Lieutenant Commander Chun, he said, consulting his datapad. We received your distress beacon 6 days ago. Maya nodded and did not relax her stance. I repaired it on day 10, she confirmed. What took you so long? The question was not hostile, but it was direct in a way that made the commander uncomfortable. Standard response time for this sector, he explained. We came as fast as we could. Maya finally allowed some of the tension to leave her shoulders. Understood, she said. My crew is ready for evacuation. The commander looked past her, at the compound, and then back at her face, which was still marked with healing wounds from the Reaver attack. How, he asked it, was the only word that seemed adequate. Maya shrugged with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. We needed shelter, she said. So I built shelter. She gestured for the rescue team to follow her and began explaining the compound layout with the efficiency of a military briefing. The inner chamber has the most stable climate control, she said. I recommend evacuating the Villani from there first, as they have been under significant physical stress. Commander Vexal followed her in a daze and took notes that he knew would be classified at the highest levels. Report he would file later that day would circulate to Galactic Union Command and spark debates that would continue for decades, not because it contained military secrets or diplomatic scandals, but because the implications were too significant to ignore. The human had not just survived a Class 7 Deathworld, she had domesticated it. She had taken a planet designed by evolution to kill everything, and she had bent it to her will, through nothing but determination and ancient knowledge and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The rescue operation took 3 hours to complete. Medical teams assessed the Villani and found them in better condition than any of the experts had predicted. Ambassador Kethvari was the last aboard the rescue cruiser, and he paused at the top of the ramp to look back at Maya. I will be requesting a personal meeting with the Terran ambassador when we return to civilized space, he announced. Maya raised an eyebrow in question. My government needs to understand something, the ambassador continued. We have been treating humans as junior partners in galactic affairs. He paused, and his silver eyes held a new respect that had not been there 18 days ago. We have been wrong, he said. We need to understand what we are really dealing with. Maya smiled, and it was a genuine smile this time, without the predatory edge. That is probably wise, she agreed. Cruiser lifted off, and Maya watched through the viewport as Vaxer 9 grew smaller beneath them. The red jungle faded into distance, and the compound she had built became just a speck on the surface of a hostile world. Navigator Pelani approached her with a cup of something warm that the ship's galley had provided. What happens now? She asked. Maya took the cup and inhaled the steam with evident pleasure. Now we go home, she said. We file reports and attend debriefings, and eventually everything returns to normal. She paused and looked at the Villani, who had gathered around her in the observation lounge. But you will remember, she added. And you will tell others what you saw. Ambassador Kethvari nodded slowly. We will tell them about the human who built a fortress from nothing, he said. We will tell them about the Deathworlder who refused to let a savage world decide who lived and who died. He reached out and touched her hand with gentle reverence. We will tell them about Maya Chun, he finished, and perhaps they will finally understand. 3 months later, Ambassador Kethvari sat in a conference room on the Galactic Union homeworld, across from the Terran ambassador. The Terran ambassador was a woman named Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, and she reminded him so much of Maya that it made his heart ache. She listened to his report with patience and asked questions that showed she understood exactly what he was trying to convey. When he finished, she smiled and pushed a small cup toward him across the table. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered. "It is a mild stimulant we cultivated from a plant that evolved to poison us." She paused and her smile widened. "We just learned to like it." Kethvari accepted the cup with trembling hands and took a small sip of the bitter liquid. It was terrible. He drank it anyway because he was beginning to understand that humans did not avoid things simply because they were difficult or dangerous or unpleasant. They adapted, they persisted, they survived. And somehow along the way they had become the most terrifying and wonderful species the galaxy had ever known. He set down the cup and met the ambassador's eyes with a new understanding. "I think," he said slowly, "that my people have much to learn from yours." Dr. Okonkwo nodded, and her expression held the same ancient wisdom he had seen in Maya's eyes during those 18 impossible days. "We look forward to teaching you," she replied. "After all, that is what humans do." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something almost conspiratorial. "We find things that try to kill us," she said, "and we turn them into friends." Kethvari thought about the coffee in his cup, and the world they had survived, and the human who would save them all. Then he laughed. It was the first time he had laughed since before the crash. It would not be the last, and somewhere across the galaxy on a savage world called Vaxxer 9, the creatures of the jungle still avoided a certain clearing where walls of silica wood stood empty but unbroken, a monument to human stubbornness, a warning to anything that might think humans were easy prey, a reminder that some species do not just survive, they conquer.